Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the show, head over to patreon.com/wellness with Jer. I'm a professional mental health provider, not a professional podcaster. So any likes and subscribes and shares is all super helpful for people to find the podcast. Super stoked about the episode I have for you today. We have a special guest on, a non-therapist guest on. Today I am joined by Mark Hampton. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Jeremy.
Mark comes from, I'm just going to say a tech background, Mark, and you can correct me as you get into your own story. But we connected through the Taoist Institute, which is a big social construction institution. For regular listeners of the podcast, I've had Sheila McNamee on, who's one of the co-founders. And Mark actually worked with one of the other co-founders of the Taoist Institute, which is Ken Gergen. And so we've connected over social construction, but coming to it from very different life experiences and different professions. And so while there's some interplay between that background, I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Cool.
So Mark, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit and sort of how it is that you found the Taoist Institute and sort of your background in coming at it from a different field and coming into social construction and your work with that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I would see my story as having sort of two parallel tracks. So maybe one would be a very or relatively typical middle class upbringing in New Zealand, which with a deep interest in how things work, which led to an engineering degree in microelectronics, and that led into a career. About maybe 8 years into that career, I founded a company that was a sort of classic startup story. So I was living in France at that time. That company became headquartered in the Silicon Valley for a few years. Grew to around 25 people or so, and then was bought. At that stage, I was really looking forward to getting out of engineering. And so maybe, by then I was sort of in my mid-30s. I'm 50 now. And I think that the sort of parallel track I was mentioning was, I would say, in my early years and teenage years, I was not put off by ideas which were, let's say, pseudoscientific or considered to be, or ideas of let's say how consciousness may function or not function, with the idea of astral projection and all sorts of hypnosis, and these were interesting topics to me, but they never really had any let's say space inside the education system. And that interest was still there in my mid-20s, and I was reading academic journals on consciousness studies and continued to have that sort of interest in consciousness studies. And in my sort of late 20s, in those journals on consciousness studies, it became sort of quite obvious that meditation, and particularly Buddhist meditation, was perhaps a really insightful way into understanding more about consciousness. And that was a track that I pursued with increasing energy after the company was bought. So it gave me some time. It was not sort of a retirement event for me, but it did give me some breathing space to really pursue other interests. And that was a lot of time spent on the cushion and exploring that sort of space of Buddhist psychology, philosophy, and I came across some challenging ideas in that space, which is the notion of, which is called non-Buddhism, which is non-Buddhism is I would say a critical view of Buddhism, which comes out of a field of non-philosophy, which is also perhaps a critical view of philosophy. And I was that really opened my eyes to this idea that there was perhaps some interesting contributions that Western types of thinking about these things could contribute to the Buddhist tradition, and or at least the Buddhist tradition as understood in the sort of more Western context.
Yeah.
And so I started looking for how could I get a, let's say, Western vocabulary to describe some of the experiences I was having and some of the intuitions I was having, and that I turned towards sociology. Found that was lacking a lot of the insights that I was aware of through those practices. Found this notion of social psychology, and then in there stumbled on Kenneth Gergen's work and social constructionism, and that's what got me interested in social constructionism. And I met Ken. He provides like a reading session of one of the books he had written with his wife, and that was a really fantastic little short course. And Ken offered to sort of tutor me or direct me in a diploma program at the Taos Institute. So I took about a year just basically preparing for that 2-year diploma, because I didn't have any sort of background in social psychology.
Yeah.
And then did the diploma with Ken, and that diploma has sort of followed on to an interest in relational biology, and some of the insights from relational biology and social constructionism had a very interesting intersection for me in the space of artificial intelligence, as saying, like, could we actually take some of these ideas and apply them from a perspective of technology as a technology of ethics, and saying that, well, technology impacts our social context, and we should, I believe, have a moral ambition when we're deploying or not deploying technologies. And at that time, AI was not in the headlines. And I think we can see how much impact that technology is already having and probably will continue to have. And I would say I'm more worried than anything about that, because I was sort of hoping that we may find other alternative ways of deploying that technology, or thinking about that technology even. But the horse is bolted, or the Pandora's box is open to some extent.
Yeah, well, and it's an interesting conversation, I think, with having some of your background in the tech world of like AI before it became AI, as like someone like me, a therapist, has heard about it, or a lot of people, I think, discovering it through ChatGPT, and there's been a lot of fear mongering, but also I know some of your work with processism and talking about like essentialism and materialism and capitalism, like as like these things haven't been helpful, and AI sort of got folded in, I'm going to say, into that capitalistic model of like, how do we use it to keep the machine running, as opposed to how do we step back and look at some of this stuff for how we could do it differently.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's definitely just another technology which is pushing the foot further on the accelerator. And I think that, a lot of people are very worried about where we're accelerating toward, right? Because it certainly looks like a cliff if you consider some of the sort of ecological risks. But even I think we can have serious doubts about what we're doing at a sort of social context, right? I mean, I think right now in the world there's all sorts of very, I guess, concerning and morally sort of outrageous things going on at scales which are quite frightening. And yeah, I mean, I think technology is accelerating all of that, and we probably would, in the ideal world, have a conversation about where are we going before we hit the accelerator harder.
Yeah, well, and using some of, I mean, there's this back and forth between where technology is at and I think like research is at, and in the psych world, I was taught this, 15, 20 years ago, that like research is always 20 years behind where culture is. And so we're already acknowledging there's this gap. And that was, I mean, I didn't grow up with the internet. Like in college, the internet was ubiquitous and existed, but like we had no longitudinal information on how we'd all be walking around with a supercomputer in our pocket someday. Like, so I think we've always been behind science, quote unquote, like the capital S science is based on research, and that model's always been behind where the culture is. So we're starting behind, and then technology is accelerating.
Yeah, I think in the tech world, the sort of, I would say most of the sort of framing of what people are doing is in a very traditional sort of modern context, right? So most people who are working in that space or studying in that space, they're coming from some sort of, let's call it the hard sciences background. They're computer scientists or maybe they're physicists or mathematicians, and that those sorts of, let's say, educational paths don't lead to questioning much about the sort of social norms that surround us. And so a lot of people would consider technology to be amoral, so neither good nor bad, right? So the classic example being, you take a hammer, it's the user of the hammer, right? I can use the hammer to hit a nail, I can use it to break a window, and that's nothing to do with the hammer. And that is, I think, an argument or a point of view which is thoroughly undone in contemporary philosophy and in fields like social constructionism, where we can really see that which types of hammers come into existence and when they come into existence is primarily a moral question of who is engaging in the work and what is the social context that is orienting that work. And a lot of technologists they're simply working on a premise that says that if you can do it, you should do it, because if the technology is amoral, there is nothing bad or theoretically nothing good about technical progress, right? And in the perspective of, and this is quite terrifying when you look at technologies which can have such huge impacts as I don't know, the classic example would be something like nuclear weapons or something, but there's also the recent advances in bioweapons and so on. It goes that people are doing things just because they can, and technologists would be let's say wise to I would think have a broader education, which is not what our society typically proposes to technologists.
Yeah, well, and I think I'm pretty critical of the education system. As an American, our education system is deeply flawed in a lot of unique ways. But there's also this siloing of information where, like, right, as a computer scientist, what ethics are you studying? What philosophy are you studying? Those are liberal arts concepts, As a therapist, I took lots of ethics classes, but just about the ethics of therapy, not necessarily ethics in other fields or other areas. So it's always this sort of silo of where you're getting your information. And I don't know, all gas pedal, no brakes. Like there hasn't been a point of pausing. Even you brought up nuclear weapons, and I thought of Oppenheimer, like, right, this cultural phenomenal movie that is saying like, hey, remember this big thing that nobody really thought through? And like, we didn't stop to think through anything. Again, we just kind of went, what a great movie. Let's give it a lot of awards and move on.
Yeah, it's quite terrifying how I would say how normalized that whole situation has become in sort of Western culture, right? That like there was this mass atrocity committed, primarily civilians targeted in a nuclear test on humans, basically. I mean, the document, I've been to Hiroshima, and it's a absolutely haunting experience. And I think we perhaps don't get to see the realities of that, because Japan is, still occupied to some extent, right? I mean, it still has very large American military bases on it, and the Japanese culture is not about going back to that time and looking at what was done, but from somebody who didn't have a particular role in that, right? I was looking at that from the perspective of someone from New Zealand. It's absolutely terrifying that was done.
Yeah, and just this idea then that, like, not only are people not studying ethics, technologists are not being exposed to that as a concept, but also, like, our models of ethics are probably outdated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the key subjects of the the reading that I did during that diploma was in sort of, I would say, moral philosophy. I mean, you can only cover so much of that territory, but it definitely went from the stage of, let's say, unconscious incompetence to a stage of conscious incompetence, and I think the contemporary ethics is particularly valuable but it is not easily accessed, right? I mean, as you were saying, there's this delay between what's going on in the culture and what's being studied in the universities, or what's going on, but there's also this huge delay in terms of the education system and what's actually being discussed or developed in contemporary academia, right? I mean, I think I would say that most of our framing of most of the topics that you'll go through, if you go through high school and you walk out of high school, you've pretty much got like a late 19th century understanding of the world, right? I mean, you don't understand quantum physics. You don't have a deep grasp of many of the things that are central in our sort of current contemporary context, right? And things like the idea that technology is amoral is sort of just part and parcel of it, right? So I think that sort of work of deconstructing that can only happen once you're outside of the mainstream sort of academic track for more or let's say educational track for most people, right? There are niche topics where you may you start to access contemporary knowledge in a niche field and at a level of a master's student or something, but it's very hard in our culture to actually turn back to education once you've left that, right? Like when you're in your 30s or 40s, and you could probably learn quite a lot. There's the house mortgage and the kids and all the rest of it, which means it's very, very hard to turn back and study.
Yeah, and I don't want to get on my soapbox about capitalism, but like this idea, like of you need to have your basic needs met somehow, and so it's not having a ton of time. You had that time because your company was bought, and so not retiring and having a cushy life, but having time enough to engage with some of these things, having time enough to have a background in some sort of philosophy like Buddhism or non-Buddhism, and understanding like not everyone has that experience. Some kid who's a computer scientist maybe is very gifted in this area, but coming from a lack of means. And so what's their goal? Is I'm going to take this coding job because I need to get my own place. And like, there isn't, again, I think some of it is that system of keeps the machine running, which I don't have a solution to, but it's a different, it's just a paradigm shift on how we do education and what is the goal of that, to say, let's do things in an ethical way, or let's do things in a sustainable way. Like that's a conversation we have more now, but sort of in the hospice care status of ecological change and climate disaster.
Yeah, I was quite surprised, and it's really stuck with me when I was reading Nietzsche about this notion of what is moral action, right? This idea that if I'm actually going to take a moral decision, it will be deemed immoral by those around me. It's a very interesting idea, right? That what we would consider to be the good is social norms, right? So there is no real moral decision not to, I don't know, for example, randomly drive your car into a stranger or something. This is just, it's not a decision, because the social norms are so conditioned that you're not going to step outside of the bounds of most normal behavior.
Yeah.
And then if somebody is actually going to make a moral decision, it will be to step outside the bounds of those social norms, which will then be deemed by those who have adopted the social norms to be immoral behavior. So it's this very sort of paradoxical thing, right? That moral progress actually requires moral transgression. And these sorts of ideas are not, or at least not widely understood, right? Like when we say something, we want to have an ethical outlook or be moral. Like these are not static things, right? These are all in movement all the time, and that's part of the, I guess, part of the risk of things like AI, artificial intelligence, is that it can start to really cement in some of the moral norms that are present now. They actually inhibit a lot of those things being questioned later when they should be or could be.
Yeah. And so this is where I get a little out of my depth, but like, is there, at least in theory, a different way for AI to be employed around those things? Like, my experience of AI is
absolutely. I mean, I think there's without even needing to really challenge our moral norms, you could already raise serious concerns about what's going on in AI research, right? So one of the things interesting about AI is that it's this term artificial intelligence, right? And if you ask most AI researchers to define intelligence, they won't be able to do a better job than most psychologists, right? It's a very ungraspable sort of term, right? So it's sort of and this is already a significant problem for a science, for let's call it a hard sciences sort of domain, right? Where your actual what you're studying, you don't have a good definition of. But so what fills in that gap is, let's say, a sort of like an everyman different definition of intelligence, right? So what is our social norms in terms of what do we consider intelligence to be? It's sort of like what's inside somebody or something, right? So somebody, an individual, is intelligent, or a machine is intelligent, right? That whole way of understanding intelligence is problematic, because now that I've put the intelligence inside something, the measure of intelligence will be autonomy, and we know from our own life that we're not autonomous, right? Like you don't get anywhere without your parents and without all the support structures around you. You don't have language without people teaching you to speak and read, and this is in that sort of understanding of intelligence as being, let's call it a collective social achievement, is not, let's say, taken seriously inside that space of artificial intelligence. And so this pursuit of autonomy is a real problem, because if you're pursuing autonomy, then the, let's call it, agents that you're creating will be in the moral service of whoever owns that agent, right? So when you're a researcher and you're busily working on autonomous, cars, that same technology is autonomous drones, is autonomous military applications. So there's a choice there, right? Do I want to work on building autonomous systems, or do I want to work on building, say, more effective educational processes, right? Like, can we make education more effective for people? That's a big challenge, right? So the researcher can choose where do they put their time and energy, right? Are they going to do it trying to make drones more effective, or are they going to, let's say, make the the education system more effective, or our political processes more effective, or there's so many possibilities there, right? So even if you frame it in our current moral norms, there's a lot of opportunity to orient people away from, let's say, things that at scale will have obvious bad outcomes, right? I mean, it's very obvious to anyone who thinks about it for a short time that autonomous weapon systems, without a culture that knows how to set the bounds for that, is going to lead to very, very bad outcomes, right? We have the Oppenheimer example, right, of what happens if you build it, someone will push the button, so these sorts of things, I think we could immediately be putting the brakes on, and it's not that would suddenly take away lots of work for these people to be doing, right? I mean, you can still be applying AI in many spaces where it is actually, you know, directly benefiting humans, right? I mean, there's a lot to do in, I think, you know, education, health, and this is where you get that thing where technology is not amoral, right? We get autonomous drones because that's something which you can sell in the mass market, and you can get a lot of attention for that work as an academic and so on, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think AI and its applications is already a space where there's already a lot of room for improvement. But yeah, as you say, there's how can AI be sort of like rethought of is another sort of bigger question, right? Is to say, well, can we think about intelligence as being a cooperative, collective outcome? And then if we understand intelligence in that way, we become far more interested in the relations and the processes which are going on in some broader context than a particular piece of software or a particular person.
Yeah, well, and some of that moves into where processism comes in something like, these social construction is not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening in a void. And so there's sometimes, we talked a little bit for recording, so before I hit record, but like you brought up that there are feedback loops. Some of them are going in reverse and some of them are really moving forward, and we're missing that moving forward piece of it in a lot of our models.
Yeah, so this is those ideas come out of relational biology, right? So relational biology is it's quite a, I would say, technical approach. It's actually a mathematical approach to biology. So people working, there's very few people who work in this space, but they would consider mathematical biologists. So they actually are using mathematics, which was found or invented in the early 20th century, to try and apply a different sort of way of modeling and thinking about biological systems to be able to answer questions like what is life, which was the sort of one of the central questions for Robert Rosen, who was a major contributor in relational biology. And that question, he was able to actually say, well, here is the relational dynamics, the relational structure and the process which must occur for a system to be considered living. And now you can actually look at that and say, well, okay, if I analyze a system and the relations that are going on in that system, whether it be made of carbon or whether it be made of other types of elements, whether it be what we consider to be life in the sense of what's available on planet Earth, you could look at a system, an alien system, and actually see those relational dynamics are either there or they're not. It's either living or it's not. And that sort of formalism being brought to biology is very surprising, and it has some very deep implications into how we think about science and even, I would say, broader questions in terms of how we think about modernity. Basically, one of the points that Rosen was making was this idea that there are complex systems, and a subcategory of complex systems are anticipatory systems, and a subset of those anticipatory systems are living systems. And if we look at what an anticipatory system involves, it involves this notion of being able to predict potential futures and act in the present. So we have this way, and I mean, we all experience this all the time, of being able to anticipate. And this is something which you'll see at the level of just a single-celled organism, to even things which we wouldn't consider to be living in the classic sense, or something like a social institution or an organization. Mm-hmm. And so that idea of anticipation, or this, what is often called final causation, was excluded from modernity. And so if we go back to sort of the work of people like Descartes and Newton in particular, mm-hmm. there's this ability at the beginning of sort of the Newtonian revolution to be able to make very accurate models of mechanical systems, what Rosen would consider to be simple systems. And all you need is the current dynamics of the system to be able to predict what's going to happen to the next state. So you have the current state, and you can predict the next state. So this works for simple systems. And it's very, very powerful. It's allowed us to develop all sorts of technologies. But it will not allow us to understand things like biological systems. It will not allow us to understand intelligence or consciousness or many other things. And so this idea of final causation was actually, it was common in, for example, Aristotle established this notion of four causes, right? As a way of explaining any sort of, if you want to be able to explain something, you'd term it in these four causes that would give you different perspectives on explaining it. And final causation was always problematic because not problematic, I would say, for the people who were living at that time, but became problematic in modernity because final causation could be interpreted through a teleological lens, that God had a final plan, and that what was unfolding was being, let's say, put in motion and established. The future was already established by God. Mm-hmm. And so science was very anti this, right? And this in the beginning of modernity, there's this real competition of how we're going to get God out of science. Mm-hmm. so that we could have the science that we see in modernity, and final causation got thrown out along with that idea. And what Rosen did published is a book on anticipatory systems. The first person to really sort of publish a book was saying this is a cross-disciplinary topic. He published in 1985, I believe, a book called Anticipatory Systems, which is the first time where somebody actually just looks across sort of the discipline and says there is this concept of anticipation going on in all these different disciplines, whether it be sociology or psychology or computer science or biology, so on. And we can actually study anticipation as a topic of itself, and we can use the tools of relational biology to formalize that. And that's had an interesting sort of, story that's unfolded from that point, right, where people have developed not directly in line with Rosen, who stayed focused on relational biology, but have sort of taken those ideas and developed a transdisciplinary field of anticipation studies. Mm-hmm. So anticipation studies is a very interesting sort of broader take on this notion of anticipation. And within that, you can find this notion of future studies, which may be interesting to many people who are practicing in psychology, because it's a way of, let's say, making this notion of final causation concrete, in the sense that once we take anticipation as being one aspect of understanding the world that has value, we can start to see that the future is a resource, and that how I imagine the future may not be the way you imagine the future.
Mhm.
And in my context, it may be much better for me to imagine the future in the way you imagine the future, right? So I could learn that, and suddenly I would benefit a lot. So there's this notion of futures literacy, or where some people through UNESCO are actually trying to introduce this as a topic of education to, let's say, promote the idea that there are different ways of thinking about the future and understanding the future. And I think it's a very interesting space in terms of what it might open up for I guess, psychotherapy or psychology.
Yeah, and I think that siloing of information, again, a lot of therapists know about AI to say, like, we don't want AI chatbots doing therapy, and like that's as much exposure as we have to it, right? Like it's not a thing where it's like there's an application beyond sort of a chatbot, I think is what most people sort of have it, or they go like the sci-fi route of like Skynet, and that's not, we're not really talking about either of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a fairly long history of chatbots or the equivalent being used in some sort of notion of therapy, right? There's some very funny early stories of Eliza and the sort of very simple chatbot, which had some great success in its role as a therapist early on. So I mean, I can definitely understand why people would be worried about that, and there's a good reason to be worried about it. But I also think we're probably underestimating how much impact AI is going to have and how quickly it's going to happen, right? We're sort of in the middle of a hype cycle. So right now, people have been hearing about AI a lot, like you might have heard about the internet a lot in 1998, right? And 1999 was the bubble, and the internet sort of was suddenly, not going to have much of an impact. And, 10 years later, pretty much everyone who was doing anything commercial in the world had an internet website, and anybody studying anything probably was using the internet. And those sorts of transitions are going to happen for AI. I think it's and probably faster. That's so much we can note is just the technology. It can scale out, building on top of all of the technologies which are already in place, right? Like you've got as you said, you've got your supercomputer in your pocket, and when the next big AI, sort of, let's say, leap happens, you just download the app, right, right there. So the time to deploy is crazy short. Yeah. So I think it's not on it's probably not on the radar of many people in terms of, like all of us, we don't tend to think in these sorts of let's say exponential curves, right? We sort of project linear into the future, and we don't necessarily see how fast these shifts are going to happen. And AI is, it's again one of these technologies, right? Because we can do it, we're doing it. And we're doing it to pursue, there's a huge sort of interest from investors, because they see this as offering potentially massive financial gain. And those are the sorts of drivers, unfortunately, which are the same old drivers, which have somewhat got us into the predicament we're in, right? And I think that's
right.
I guess to bring it back maybe to this notion of why I got interested in process philosophy and the role of the place for that, right? It's to some extent we could say that modernity is sort of running out of steam. That way of thinking about the world in terms of simple machines, whether it be the human body or human society or individuals, that is clearly not sufficient to deal with the current challenges that we're all facing. And a more complex understanding is certainly necessary, and I think in some fields like relational biology, it's well established in a theoretical sense that there's a lot we can do there. But this move from essentialism, which was sort of, let's say, became very dominant in the development of modernity toward a sort of like balancing that with a conception of processism, or inspired by process philosophy. That's an alternative which I think may actually be able to address some of the sort of, let's say, the challenges of modernity, right? And I guess, unfortunately, society is probably going to have to go through quite a lot of pain before people are going to look to those sorts of alternatives. Right?
Yeah, well, and I think in my daily work, which is not super heady philosophy all the time, although I'm a pretty philosophical therapist, that there's this awareness for people that like there's burnout, this endless production, this capitalism for capitalism's sake is unhealthy and unsustainable. And so in these very real world aspects, people are like learning some of this. Society is going through some of those pains already. And like kind of what you're saying is like there's not necessarily a ready-made model that's accessible to everyone as another option. Some of this stuff is still pretty niche. Even in the therapy world, social construction is still pretty niche. So like it's one of those things where I think people are getting there on their own, and also we don't have that model out there for like what to do instead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a huge challenge for, I would say, Western cultures, right? I mean, I think there are some other cultures that do have, let's say, a closer connection to these ideas of process philosophy, and that may be one path that, if we want to be optimistic, is that we may actually see that the competitive drive in the sort of capitalist system, once it starts to see that there's other models that are out competing it, then there will be a huge pressure to shift, right? So that's, at the moment, it's hard to say whether the model that the Chinese are developing, right, that sort of perspective which they're developing is very, it seems to me, very informed by modernity. And they've sort of been dealing with the side effects of rampant capitalism in terms of environmental damage and things, in a way that is, I think, somewhat optimistic, right? I mean, if you look at how radical the change in terms of things, just so the air quality in Beijing, or if you look at the installation rate of solar panels, I mean, in China, it's mind-boggling, right? They are installing, or they have something like more than half of the world's solar power generation capacity, and they're installing faster than anybody else. Now, they have a very sort of science-centric, materialistic dynamic in that culture, but they also do have, not that long ago, a connection into ideas like Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, which do create a lot of space for a sort of process-centric perspective. And you can see a shift happening in China where more space is being made for those ideas, sort of trying to connect back to that, let's say, to the traditional Chinese civilization. Yeah. So maybe that is a place where we'll see some alternatives, which will be, let's say, appealing to the West as well, right? Because if we, for example, in 2017, I learned that China wrote into its constitution its ambition to be an ecological civilization. And it's not uncommon at all there to see this promoting of a sort of human-centric well-being in the future, of this idea of things not just being about material well-being, but about living in harmony with nature and the opportunity for cultural expression and sort of like this is an interesting, I'm not going to be I don't want to come across as being 100% pro that model, but I think as a counterbalance to the excess of the sort of Western essentialism, it may be the sort of first barrier that we run into, right? Where suddenly we're seeing a different civilization being more successful on many of the things that we care about.
Right. Yeah.
So that might be a way that we could get some pressure into the system to move without the system having to collapse, right? Because that's another sort of scarier alternative, is that we actually go through a civilizational collapse, as most civilizations, or all civilizations except the Chinese one so far, has not collapsed. But I think the history is a story of civilizations collapsing, and if we were to avoid that, then I guess you need some other sort of pressure that would allow us to shift from that sort of essentializing perspective on ourselves and on the broader environment. And
I think and I think for so many people this is heady stuff, but like it's applicable in our daily life. We understand even systems thinking, like people understand they exist in an ecosystem, their neighborhood, their family of origin, their school systems, everyone's aware that impacts them. And so we exist in sort of this their postmodernism is around us. Most people are familiar, maybe not quoting Foucault, but being able to say right, I understand that there's multiple variables here impacting this, and moving away from that modern approach of society or of science to say let's limit the variables and just study this one replicatable thing, and leaning into the complexity. I think you used the word connection before, and that is what I see in therapy so much, is people are wanting to connect to their community, connect to their pasts, their history, their ancestry, whatever it is. There's this idea of existing not as an individual, but in community and in this ongoing process, that this is a thing of ongoing feedback, but not just from the past, that looking into the future and building a better future. So I think, again, a lot of people are there just not having any sort of formal training or study on these topics, but there's a desire, it's just not scaled.
It's interesting about how much maybe the let's call it the way that we verbalize and the language that we have, it tends to constrain us into that particular model, right? Because that's the way that we talk about individuals and we talk about things in an essentializing manner, and it's almost like a continual reinforcement of those things. But I think that there's you mentioned Foucault, and Foucault would make this case that there's sort of the body will rebel at some point, right? And I think that's what you might often see in with your clients is that they actually are suffering physically, and this is, I think, one of the things which we see throughout a society, right? Is there is a huge amount of bodies rebelling against the sort of the attempt to impose certain sorts of ideas, right? Certain types of ideologies. Even if people are languaging those ideologies, their bodies are not buying the Kool-Aid, right? Maybe they're drinking too much of it, but the body is having the appropriate reaction to that sort of thing.
Yeah, and some of these, imperialistic or colonizing ideas and how that looks for complex PTSD, is a big deal. Maybe not across the board in therapy, but in certain pockets of therapy, understanding things like intergenerational trauma, and that separating our bodies, separating our brain from our bodies, or the attempts to, has been very damaging. Separating our bodies from the environment they exist in has been very damaging. So, there's so much application. It's like railing against the system that exists and being there's a better option. Let's just do that already.
It's certainly a huge challenge to try and take a different perspective on these things, right? Like I would not at all promote myself as being a process centric in my way of being, although that is my intention. But we are continually pulled back in toward this sort of essentializing way of being, right? But just the way that we're encouraged, incited to interact in society, and like, you know, the fact that we all are engaged in this capitalist machine, or most of us, whether we want to be or not, right?
Right.
So yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, it's interesting that you meet people who are say looking for more connection, and I guess I see a huge amount of people who are trying to still sort of like hold it together as that individual, right? They're looking for, there's a huge amount of discourse out there about, you know, finding your authentic self, and this idea of the you know, what's the right thing for you, and your truth, and this sort of, let's say, affirming of identity, right? Whether that's very, very strong. It's almost, there's definitely a big contradiction in some of the sort of, let's say, insight that you could take from post-structuralism, and how that's been interpreted in sort of like a postmodernism, and where we could deconstruct these identities, and then postmodernity is often sort of taken the other side of that coin, right? And said, well, no, we're going to really leap on these identities, which maybe were not so easily attainable, and we'll take on different identities. And it's certainly tolerance is a very good property inside of a culture, right? It would definitely support that. But the essentialization of people is, you know, it's just more of the same. And
I think every to oversell it maybe a tiny bit, a revolutionary idea has like a counterbalance, where like I see the co-opting of self-care into capitalism as that means your yoga class, that means your fancy yoga clothes, that means your big fancy spa day, and like this concept of like, this was a good idea, and then capitalism's like, no, we're not allowing rest, we need to make money off of rest. And so there's this constant, I think, like push and pull of, we need to get out of this system, and then the system says, I can absorb that and shift it. So now even in my work, I don't talk about self-care, I talk about cultivating joy, because I needed to shift my language from, this isn't just a box to check, this is a quality of life issue, as opposed to, and I did my self-care over my lunch break, so check that box and back to being a productive human.
It's you can definitely see a long tradition of that in the West. I love this story of, I don't know how true it is, right? But I like the story of this idea that during the sort of, you know, the revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, you know, that was actually seen as a huge opportunity for manufacturers of clothing and jeans and things, right? Where you could now have your own style, right? So suddenly the market exploded, because, you know, you could have these styles which would be personalized, and your identity, you could show how unique you were by buying stuff, surprise, surprise, to dress up in your unique way, right? And this was just like an all-in for the capitalist infrastructure, right? And so you're right, there's this way that it's very, very good at transactionalizing, you know, you have to wonder, right? Nearly everything. And I guess this is one of the opportunities which I saw for AI, is that AI, artificial intelligence, depending on how that's built, you can understand it as a way of materializing process and relations and dynamics, right? So there's lots of things that happen in the world that you can't actually physically touch them, right? But you can actually collect information about what's going on, and that information ends up, inside a computer, and it's been materialized actually, right? So we can talk about the artificial intelligence as being a way of being able to materialize a lot of things which are immaterial, and then we can actually potentially, let's say, have an assistance to being more sensitive to processes and relations which we can't touch or see or feel, right, directly. And so that was one of the things which got me really excited about the potential for artificial intelligence, was this idea that it could actually bias us toward a sensitivity to process and relation. And depending on how it was, thought about and built, you could imagine that some sort of artificial intelligence that is, I would call it a relational intelligence, right? So something that actually allows us to be sort of, let's say, more sensitive to the relations and processes that we're actually are both constructing us, and we are also part of constructing.
Yeah.
And that vision is I think, my optimistic take on what AI could do and what I would like to work on. Because I think this is sort of what let's say the essentializing processes that we, the way that capital functions, the way that the market functions, that will let's say tend to simplify a lot of these things, right? And say, well, basically, make you ignorant of these relations and these dynamics, and then propose some sort of material substitute, right? Like, buy this car and you'll feel as if you're, loved by the woman selling the car in the advertising or something. But obviously that sort of those techniques work very well. And so the idea of some sort of, let's say, assistance that is actually serving your interests in the sense of making you more sensitive to things could be a counterbalance to a lot of that, right? Because if that is actually not owned by another person, like another entity, right? If it's not owned by Meta or Facebook or Google or OpenAI, then it could potentially be in the service of your broader interests, right? Like, and then it's a moral, technical, it's a moral question in terms of, do you orient that towards collaboration and cooperation? Or not, right? And that would be what I would prefer to do, is say, well, let's actually orient those sorts of systems towards collaboration and cooperation. Let's allow for more effective organization and dynamics from movements of the citizens, right? Let's enable that and facilitate that. There's some very interesting sort of precedents of not exactly this, but if you look at the open source software movements, it's quite surprising, right? How successful in some ways that's been, where you have like most people will have heard of this operating system called Linux, which is does a similar function to Microsoft Windows, but most computers that are sort of on the, let's say, the backbone of the internet would be using Linux, right? And like your Android phone is based largely on that sort of technology. So that technology was not owned by any corporation, right? It's open source. You can take it and do as you please with it, pretty much. And that sort of idea of saying, well, you can actually have technologies that can't be captured by the capitalist structure. We already know how to do that, right? So this is an interesting sort of, I think, an interesting potential where we can say, well, we could actually have technologies that are not in the service of capitalism.
And again, I think that desire is there. Nobody likes the current subscription model of literally everything we use. Like, we're all pretty tapped out on needing to pay our $6 to $15 a month for the things we like to use. We don't. So, I think a lot of that stuff, right? The desire is there, just scale and messaging, right? Because the system that exists is going to exert influence to, once again, try and absorb a lot of this stuff back. Huh.
Yeah. I mean, this is why the open source model is so interesting, right? Because Linux was so successful, and you can imagine the financial incentives for Microsoft to make sure that it was not successful. I mean, at some point, Microsoft was the largest corporation in the world, and it did not end up owning that whole sort of internet infrastructure space, right? Because of Linux. So it shows that even if you have the most powerful, corporate interests, that actually there are alternatives which can resist that and succeed.
Yeah.
So it's not a hopeless outlook.
Yeah, I am trying to end on some optimism. Mark, what do you do when you get sort of pulled into the rabbit hole of doom and gloom? This is going to be the death of us all. Like, what's sort of the balancing act that you have? I know on a technical sense, you can go to some of this optimism and say there's a better option here, but in your maybe daily life or not on the professional side of things, what do you do to sort of?
I'd say that in a good moment, right? There's a capacity to see ourselves, understand as not being the center of the universe, and actually, participating in processes which are beyond our immediate, let's say, 5 sense experience of the world, right? So like that's definitely one sort of, I'd say it's a fairly typical approach in sort of some of the older traditions, right? Even in Western traditions of sort of taking a big picture view, right? And seeing that we're connected in so many ways across space and time, both into the past and into the future, that that what seems like an overwhelming pain is not necessarily at the scale that it seems when we're like in that, I'm the center of the universe perspective, right? And I think that's something which the social constructionism and Buddhist practices can give us some tools to be able to stay in that space where we understand the constructed nature of the self, right? And that the self is obviously part and parcel of our experience, but not necessarily the center of the universe, and that suffering is going to happen, but what the Buddhist concept of the second arrow, right? Like, if we start worrying about the worry or suffering over the fact that we're suffering, that's of our own volition, right? So we can potentially avoid that degree of suffering. And then if it's a bad day, I guess I'm just like, everybody else in my little dark depression, and I rely on people around me to pull me out of it, to sort of the very patient partner who puts up with probably way too much, and I think that's something where I don't have a magic solution for that, right? If you can sort of have these practices and these beliefs, but I sort of see the composition of what the processes that construct me and that I'm participating in, right? They didn't stop because I didn't like them. They're still there, right? Like there still is all of the potential there to be that little annoying 2-year-old, or that arrogant 13-year-old, or the overconfident 18-year-old, and and so on it goes, right? They're all there potentially, and if the context is triggering in the wrong ways, and those aspects come to life, right? And that's often, I think, this is obviously everyone will have different perspectives on this, but this is something which I think gives me some more patience with myself, right? Is that I don't subscribe to this idea that there is some ideal sort of form that I should have, or that I could have, right? It's more about what I could have. Yeah. I think that I am flawed, and that is unfortunately sometimes that's depressing, but most of the time it's not.
Yeah. Well, and I love, just some of the practices you talk about, I think, are things I've talked about regularly. And I talk about healing in community regularly too. Again, having your people, having that support. Sometimes it's not an intellectual exercise we need to engage in. Sometimes it's a relational exercise we need to engage in. And that helps us be more in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the having some sort of physical outlet as well, right? This is something which I notice is if you're in that headspace all the time, then it allows for cycles that sometimes can be hard to break out of, and physical activity is one way of, if you really are engaged in a physical activity, you basically are not going to be able to stay in that headspace. You're going to get pulled out of it whether you like it or not. So I think that's something which I try to do, right, is have some sort of at the moment it's mainly running, but in the past it's been different sports.
It's one of the reasons I love sport, and I hate the capitalism behind it, but sport on small scales is just so lovely, and it's like community and competition and pushing our body, and it's good for so much of our body. So Mark, this has been awesome, and all my concerns where it'd get too technical, and I feel like it was very accessible. So kudos to you in how you talk about this. Is there anything that you want to direct people towards? Is there anywhere where they can engage with these ideas or engage with your work as you continue to work on it? Is there anywhere that they can go to pick up the threads that we left off at?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely have a word for the Taos Institute, which is an institute that promotes social constructionism through a lot of different perspectives and forms, right? I mean, there's various different perspectives on it, and that's part of the beauty of that community, is this sort of a tolerance, and I think that it's definitely a space that there's a lot of people who work in therapy who are in that space, and I think it's a great resource for people who can have a sort of resourcing, a positive experience where if you have that sort of therapist background, I think there's a lot of people who can understand where you're coming from in that space.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes. I'm a big advocate for Taoist. Taoist saved me early in my career as I was bummed out on all the evidence-based practice. And then I read Harlene's book on conversation, language, and possibility, and was like, oh, great, I can do this. So big advocate for them as well. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time. It has been wonderful to chat with you today.
Well, thank you, Jeremy.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.